Good evening, and welcome to Haus Kunst. My name is Okwe Enwezo, the director of Haus Kunst, and it gives me particular pleasure and it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to have a conversation this evening with William Kentridge and his father, Sir Sidney Kentridge. I think that William Kentridge, many of you know. Many of you are very much aware of his illustrious career as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a theater director, as a director of operas. But what many of you don't know is that William is the son of an equally illustrious lawyer, Sir Sidney Kentridge. And it's a remarkable thing that this will be the first time that the two of them will sit on stage to talk about their careers. And the meeting ground for this conversation this evening is the exhibition Rise and Fall of Apartheid. And very simply, the reason why we have this convergence, and which for me, in many ways, is not only humbling, but also thrilling, is the individual roles that both of them have played in the evolution of South Africa since 1948. William was not quite born in 1948. But let me just simply use the opportunity to give you a context. Sir Sidney Kentridge was born in Johannesburg and studied law at the University of Oxford in England, then returned to South Africa and set up his law chambers in 1949. So this would have been 1 year after the introduction of apartheid in South Africa in 1948. But not only the fact that he set up his law firm, but he went on over the next 35 years to represent or play a role in some of the most significant cases in the history of apartheid. It's also, if my data is correct, the only lawyer, I believe, who's represented 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners: Nelson Mandela, Chief Albert Luthuli, and Desmond Tutu. And the only lawyer who's argued more cases than any other lawyer in England in the history of British law, in the British equivalent of the Supreme Court. So on both counts, I think it seems that William's illustrious career, while very much recognized, doesn't quite pale, but stands next to the illustrious career of Sir Sidney Kentridge. So let me just simply say give you one more context, that when you walk into the exhibition, some of the key trials or events that you'll find in the exhibition are events in which Sir Sidney played a direct role. He represented Nelson Mandela in the Treason Trial, represented the families during the Commission of Inquiry of the Sharpeville Massacre, which was an incredible turning point, and also represented the family of Steve Biko at the inquest. So here we are, in a sense, really confronted with the work that is so public and yet so much located within the intricacies of the law. But William, as an artist, has also responded not only specifically to the events that really racked his country, but also used aspects of the work of his father to make his own work. So this conversation this evening, I think, might be best to start chronologically, to begin in 1949, when Sir Sidney set up his law office. So Sidney, apartheid in many ways is understood as a kind of one of the most regressive political inventions. But at the same time, one can say that apartheid is really about the law, about the usage of the law to pervert justice, if you will. Talk a little bit about how your own work and your recollection of your practice as a lawyer is connected to this question.
Well, thank you, but before doing that, I'd like to say that the exhibition on show here at the moment is an absolutely staggering exhibition. I've not seen anything like it anywhere. And I'm quite frankly astonished at what the curator has been able to put together. And certainly I found it an exhibition that's brought back many old memories and a very moving exhibition. I've been asked to talk about my career. Well, the first thing I'd say, so that there are no misunderstandings, I was not a political activist in South Africa. Whatever I did there, I did purely professionally as a lawyer. And it's been pointed out that I started in practice just after the apartheid government came into power in 1948. Now, what must be understood is that from the first time that white colonists came to South Africa in the middle of the 17th century, there was always racial discrimination. But apartheid was something different. It was different because discrimination was not only permissible, it became compulsory. If you've been to the exhibition, you might have seen a film of Dr. Verwoerd, who was the architect of apartheid, speaking to a very sympathetic audience somewhere in South Africa. And he said about apartheid that apartheid simply meant good neighborliness. Now, that was the most hypocritical statement made even by that appalling man. Apartheid meant that the whole population of South Africa was divided into categories. Everyone was given a category. It could be white, it could be black, or Bantu as they were called. Mixed race, what was called Cape Colored, was another category. Asian, which was divided into Indian and Chinese. And your category under apartheid governed your whole life. It governed where you could live, what school you could go to, whom you could marry, what work you could do, where you could travel and where you couldn't travel. And it also meant that whole black and Asian communities could be removed simply by government order from places where they'd lived, sometimes for decades, sometimes for hundreds of years, just moved to some distant place without compensation for what they'd lost. usually so that white people could step in and occupy the places that they had previously occupied. Now, the white population at the beginning of the apartheid years was probably not more than 3 million, whereas the black population would have been something over 20 million. And it stands to reason that the apartheid government did not govern by consent. They governed, as our curator and introducer this evening has said, they governed by laws. They could only maintain apartheid and maintain themselves in government by laws which overrode any democratic ideas, any ideas of the rule of law. Blacks did not have any vote. If you've seen photographs of Mr. Nelson Mandela voting at the first post-apartheid election in 1994, you are seeing a man who had never before in his life had a vote in anything. And the sort of laws that were brought into operation to keep this going were laws which entitled the police to arrest people without a judicial warrant, to keep them in detention indefinitely for interrogation. There were laws which provided, for example, that black school children were not only to be segregated, but were to be given a deliberately inferior education. There was a law which, as far as I know, otherwise was only ever in force in countries like the Soviet Union and in other dictatorships, making it a criminal offense for anybody to leave the country without the permission of the government. And if one did so and then came back, it was a serious criminal offense. Well, the point of all this, and what made it so strange, is that together with this almost dictatorship of the ruling government, the court system and the legal system still functioned. When people were charged under these terrible laws, they were charged in an open court and they could have the defense of a lawyer. And although a number of the judges were appointed for political reasons because they were sympathizers with the apartheid government, one still had a chance in the courts of winning their cases. The Treason Trial was mentioned. That was a trial which ran from 1958 to 1961, in which the leaders of all the liberation movements were charged with treason. The trial, as I've said, ran for over 3 years. The judges were 3 hand-picked judges, but at the end of the trial, every accused was acquitted. So it was worthwhile going on and practicing law there, because there was something which could be done. But it was a fight against the existing laws, and every time you won one of those fights, the laws was changed to make it even stricter. But right till the end, lawyers acted for people who ran foul of the administration of the government and continued to work.
Thank you. William?
Yes.
I don't know how you feel being on the stage with your father for the first time, talking about him as a lawyer and you as an artist. And I want to begin perhaps, if you can talk a little bit about your first memories of South Africa, of your father's practice, and how your own work as an artist sort of developed and evolved.
Well, I mean, it's a treat for me to be talking with my dad here on stage. It is. We haven't ever done it before. And it's one of the things which also, the same with Okwit's exhibitions, well, why has no one done an exhibition like this before? It needed to be done. And why have we never had a I suppose there's never been a context for this to be here. So I'm very happy, I'm delighted from my side. And I hope my dad is too, to be here. We'll have to wait to the end of the discussion to check that it's all still fine. But my earliest memories of what it was to be in apartheid South Africa certainly predate any memory I have of making art. And the first memory I can date within a certain period. And this was a period in which my father would go off to work every day, and I knew he was going to Pretoria, which was far away, and then he'd come back at night. And I was told what this case was. This was during the Treason Trial from 1958 to 1961, so between when I was 3 and when I was 6 years old. But my memory of it is very specific. At the bottom of our garden, we had a group of pine trees. And I imagined these trees in my head. And we also had a tiled table, a mosaic table. And every day my father went off to what I remembered as the trees and the tile. And the trees and the tile. And I couldn't understand quite how the treason tile, which was the Treason Trial, but I have still in my head, as I speak, I can see the colors of the tiles and I can see the shape of the tree. So that was the other memory I have, which again I would place most probably that in that period, was a visit to the house of Albert Luthuli, who was the head of the African National Congress. And was he one? He wasn't one of the defendants of the treason.
He had been originally right at the beginning, but then they dropped him.
But my memory is of this man in a suit coming to a house and coming to sit in the kitchen where our cook held court, where she was working. And what struck me, well, I suppose there were two things. Firstly, I don't think I'd ever met a black man before who was not, or black person before who was not either a gardener or a maid or a nanny or a cook. In those years, those were the people that one saw as a white child growing up. That was one's interaction at a very young age. But suddenly there was a man in the kitchen, and I was astonished at the degree of adulation, respect, awe that our cook had for this man who'd come into the kitchen. As you can imagine, if you're a domestic worker and suddenly this heroic figure, I'm not sure if he'd yet won the Nobel Prize or not.
Not yet.
Not yet. So that was already a second shake. So that's between the ages of 3 and 6. Much later on, I think I was certainly aware of, was it the late 60s, the trial against newspapers for publishing information about prison conditions?
Yes, that was late 60s.
So I was very much aware of those cases going on. What I remember very much of those was my mother's incandescent rage every night at the lies that police would tell every day in court, and my father, who was dealing with them every day in court, calming her down. But I have a very clear memory of long-term rage and anger being an undercurrent directed, and I think that was a very powerful sense of understanding from a very early age what an unnatural society we lived in. I mean, obviously I went to it it was an all-boys, all-white school. And amongst the boys at school, it was there was a naturalism. There was certainly a naturalization for people who lived under apartheid. Every time you went to the cinema, you didn't think, gosh, I'm going to the cinema, but only white people can go to the cinema. You knew it was an iniquity, but it also got diluted by everyday living. But at school, there was definitely a difference between my sense of the country we're in because of the cases and the people and the conversations at dinner. I think it came to I would have been a teenager. I was starting when I was doing drawing in the evenings. I went to life drawing classes. My mother and I went to life drawing classes at Bill Ainsley's studio when I was in high school. And then when I was at university, I was doing that as well as studying politics and African history. And certainly by then, there was a very strong sense of what was happening in the country.
Well, can I just remind William of something which is very relevant to this exhibition? In 1961, there was a terrible incident at a little place outside Johannesburg called Sharpeville. A large number of the black inhabitants of that area went to a police station, and they waited outside a police station. It was a protest against the fact that they had to carry passes, which was an identity document that only black people had to carry. And they were a peaceful crowd, but the police panicked and they opened fire, and well over 100 were shot dead and many more were wounded. And there was a commission of inquiry into it. And the evidence before the inquiry included a set of photographs taken by a very brave photographer called Ian Berry, who actually was within the crowd who were being fired at by the police. The crowd were running and the police were firing into their backs. And this photographer lay flat on the grass and he took photographs. And then he took photographs afterwards of the dead bodies. And I, in my study, for the purposes of that inquiry, had a whole box of photographs of these terrible things that had happened. And it was only many, many years later, really, I was going to say when we were both grown up, but when I found out that William, as a boy of about 6, had by chance come upon those photographs. Is that right?
It was, yes, I was 6, and I remember going into your study and seeing this glossy, shallow yellow box, which I was sure would be a box of chocolates, which was going to be opened, and in fact it was a box of Kodak 8 by 10 glossy black and white photographs, which are in fact on exhibition in the exhibition here. And so I opened this lid expecting there would be chocolates, and instead there were these astonishing horrors. At the age of 6, one has a sense of children's violence against each other in the playgrounds, not as if violence didn't exist as children, but the sense of adults visiting violence on each other was kind of a new and shocking thing. And to see the difference between the tiny puncture wound of the entry of a bullet and then the same body rolled over where there's just this massive exploded flesh of the exit wound was a kind of, it completely kind of changed an understanding of the world. And I immediately put the lid on the box and felt completely guilty. And I certainly didn't mention it to you. And it was years and years later when I was making the film Felix in Exile, which is a film about bodies lying in the veldt, in the landscape, dead bodies, and how they're absorbed by the landscape and this was a film made in the 1994, so at the time of the first democratic election, when there was a lot of violence in South Africa between the ANC and Inkatha and police groups. And it was only when making that film, or even after the film was made, that I suddenly thought, what did these images that I'd been drawing remind me of? And in fact, they were harking back to those very early images of bodies lying in the veldt. So I think you're right. It was a very fundamental.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is very belatedly apologize for leaving those films where a 6-year-old could see them.
Well, perhaps, William, you can talk a little bit about this notion that you just mentioned of the landscape absorbing its own history in connection to your own approach to filmmaking, which in itself is really built on this dialectic between erasure and accretion, and the way in which the landscape of South Africa has insinuated itself repeatedly in your work. Perhaps you can speak also about the cycle of films that we have in the exhibition, the 10th cycle of the Soho Eckstein and Felix Teitelbaum films.
I think that as a connection to it, one of the points of connection in those films and in the view of the landscape definitely came, again, not directly from the work that my dad was doing as a lawyer, but from the circle of friends around. And two of those were the novelist Nadine Gordimer, and I think through her the photographer David Goldblatt. And so even when I was at school, before I was doing images myself, this other way of understanding or looking at South African landscape was very much present for me. When doing the landscape, so to talk about the technique of the animation which connects to the landscape, the technique is one of drawing and erasing constantly, so that instead of hundreds of different drawings, there's one drawing which is drawn and altered many times under the camera to get the movement and transitions and transformations that happen in the drawing. So if you draw a landscape and you have any movement through it, you are kind of constantly, of necessity, redrawing that landscape. And what it also does is, as you alter drawing, there's not a perfect erasure, there's a ghost of what the image has been before left into the paper, so that without choosing it as a subject or a theme, the idea of memory or history or transformation is built into the very technique. So if you draw a figure lying in the landscape and you just wipe that figure with a cloth, enough of it is removed for it already to be part of that drawing of the landscape. So the connection of loss of memory and the dulling of impressions and the way that relates to landscape absorbing its history. If you go to Sharpeville now, unless there is a plaque being put up or a memorial put up, there's no trace of that event that happened there. The landscape itself, as always, either through nature or through building, absorbs and covers itself up. But also Johannesburg, the city where I live and where we both lived, is a city which erases itself. I mean, it's a mining town, and so the hills around it are the tailings of the mining activity, artificial hills. And I do remember one of the cases that you had that does relate to it, which had to do with the status of these mine dumps. And there was a case about, there's still a trace of gold left in the sand of the mine dumps, and when the price of gold gets to the right level, it's worthwhile reprocessing these hills to get the residual gold out, so that what one thinks of as one's hills, which were these artificial flat yellow mine dumps outside Johannesburg, were caught somewhere between being part of the landscape, part of fixed property, and also being portable assets, things that could be carried away with a certain value. And I think you had a case relating to that, or you spoke about it if you didn't have a case.
No, there were cases about who was going to own the gold which was extracted. What about the effect on people who built houses nearby? But yes, I didn't realize that had any.
So Sidney, you began by saying that you were not a political activist. You were simply a lawyer. How is it possible to be a lawyer under apartheid and not have any kind of political role? How did you manage that?
Well, I didn't mean to say I didn't have political views or opinions. I mean, I loathed apartheid. But I played my role as a lawyer. And when you're acting as a lawyer for someone, if you're as objective as possible, you do a better job as a lawyer. I mean, it was often very frustrating. One sometimes came upon very unsympathetic judges. The law was constantly amended to make it harder to defend people. But when I wasn't an activist in the sense that I didn't really take any active part in the politics of the liberation movements. Perhaps I should have, but I didn't.
Well, William, on the other hand, you were an activist and an artist. How do you reconcile the two?
Well, in 1975, that is the year before the Soweto uprising, which there's a big section of the exhibition is 1976, when there was an uprising of school children in Soweto. Many were killed, and in a way it started the period of transformation, of instability for the government in South Africa that took another 14 years to reach fruition. In 1975, Clement Greenberg came to South Africa. And I remember he came to our house for supper.
Who's Clement Greenberg?
Clement Greenberg, the American art historian and believer in great American formalism. And he'd come to South Africa to give a prize and give a lecture. And at that stage, when I was 21, I was completely interested in a political art, in a kind of agitprop way of what a kind of a Leninist view, what are the pictures which are needed to be made in the country at the moment, working with posters and all sorts of things. And I remember him being told that, I was interested in art, and him be giving a polite hum-hum to this host's son, and then saying, and what sort of art did I like? And I said, I was interested in political art. And he said, well, let me just tell you. You take care of the art and the politics will take care of itself. And then I said, well, I was interested in figurative art. And he said, well, he preferred figurative art. It just happened that at the moment the best painters in the world were all painting abstractions, which I'm not quite sure that I believed, but it did raise for me a question later on. There was a period of a gap between the work I'd done until I was about 25, and then the work I'd came back to when I was closer to 30. The one which had a very clear political agenda, the other, which is all the work that's on the exhibition here, was when I was completely interested in politics and understood it as very central to what I was, but allowed the work to just find a much less programmatic understanding of the world. The work started from the work, and I would discover during the making of a film or a drawing what images or thoughts or themes emerged, rather than having an agenda in advance which was simply carried out in the work. So there's a strange kind of trace of it. And I would think that would come back to something that's not dissimilar to what you were saying, Dad, and that is the belief, not just the dedication in the work, but the belief in the activity itself. In your case, of practicing the law, and in my case of saying, let me work as conscientiously as I can in the studio and see what emerges, and eventually that will tell me something about myself as an artist.
Well, now I want to reverse.
Yeah.
I promise not to ask you anything about art, but perhaps it might be interesting for you to reflect on how, when you had the first idea that William was an artist, or what did you make of him being an artist? Did you think of it as a useful career for him?
Well, I don't know about useful. I thought of it as a wonderful career if you could make it. Yes, very much, at a very much higher level than the sort of career that I was pursuing. But I must admit, from the time William was 6 years old and I saw some of his childish paintings and drawings, I realized that this wasn't ordinary children's drawings, and I think I can honestly say that I always supported his drawing and his work as an artist. I don't think that I ever tried to persuade him to be anything else. And
you certainly didn't persuade me to be anything else, but there were at certain points quite challenging questions. I remember saying I was going to do a theatre production of Wojciech, and it was going to do with Handspring Puppet Company. And I remember your comment was, I'm not saying that a Wojciech with puppets is impossible. I'm just wondering why it's necessary. And I think this brand of this kind of skepticism is not without its uses. I mean, much more recently, in a piece that was done for Documenta last year, there's a sequence in which there's a Berlioz song Spectre de la Rose from La Nuit d'été. And one of the things we were doing, which was we were playing with ideas of time going backwards and running things backwards, was working with some of the music backwards. And the singer who was doing it was staying with us when you were with us, and I remembered you'd asked her what she was doing in the production. She said, one of the things is she had to sing the Spectre de la Rose backwards. And your question to the poor woman was, and what exactly is it that Berlioz got wrong when he wrote it forwards? So I think one of the things certainly that was important for me, I suppose, or of necessity, was finding the need for, or the essentialness of things that were not necessary. In the sense of the images that arrive in a picture or in a film are not necessary. They're not called for by a logical chain of reasoning, but nonetheless make a sense, or hopefully can accumulate into making a kind of meaning. And I think that is a difference, and was an important one.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I learned quite quickly in William's career was not to ask the question, what does this picture mean? He made it quite clear that if I had to ask that question, either I had failed or he had failed. And I began to understand that he was right. But as far as skepticism is concerned, I think that's part of a parent's job to ask difficult questions. A couple of years ago, William was invited to give the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. It's a very, very prestigious set of lectures. They're given in the past by people like T.S. Eliot. So when William telephoned me to say he had been invited to give the Norton lectures at Harvard, which is a series of 6 lectures, I asked him, but have you got anything to say? Which I thought was a sensible question.
And my response was, but it's a great honor to be asked.
And my reply was, well, now you've been asked, you've had the honor, you don't need to give the lectures. However, he had a lot to say, and it was very good. And in fact, I think that there are a book of it, and CDs or DVDs are coming out. But no, to get back to the question asked, I hope I have been supportive of William's art. It doesn't mean that I think that everything he does is immediately appealing to me. Some of it I find difficult. And I think any good artist will find lots of people who find his work difficult. But it's difficult and yet it's appealing.
Yeah, I just want to make maybe another bridge, especially connected to the 10 films of yours, William, that we're showing. And I think the character of Soho Exton and the character of Felix Teitelbaum both seem very reflective of your own background in South Africa and your own doubts. That Felix, in a sense, is the model of skepticism and so on. And I wonder, if there is something that both of you share in the relationship between these two figures and that have sort of accompanied the narration, if you will, of the coming to the African continent of Europeans and the industrial, era and the modern, world and economics and so on. If there's, a way that you can talk about this relationship, what you see in this figure, Sir Sidney, Exton on the one hand and Felix Teitelbaum, before William can, maybe make a comment.
If you've seen any of the films, you'll see that Soho Eckstein is, in a way, almost a cartoon figure of a traditional capitalist. He's a very stout man. He wears dark pinstriped suits. He smokes a cigar. He employs hundreds or thousands of people. And the other character, Felix Teitelbaum, represents, as far as he represents anything, is, by contrast, the spirit of the artist, whose interests are not the interest in making money. I must say that at the beginning I found that quite a difficult contrast to come to terms with. I didn't know whether William had actually met capitalists of that sort. Certainly they did exist in Johannesburg, and I think a great many of them, perhaps even most of them, were quite content with apartheid. Apartheid didn't prevent them from doing what they wanted to do. But then I started seeing them not as just figures, on the one hand, of the typical South African capitalist, and on the other hand, a much more sympathetic artist. I came to see them rather as two competing strains, not only in society but in life. What I'd call the practical life that people, even artists, have to live. They have to make a living. And on the other hand, there is the artist who is doing wonderful things, but can he really live in a society without the capitalist? And I don't know whether that's an explanation of it, but I at first found it a difficult contrast, too stark a contrast. But later I came to see it as, in a way, two sides of a personality. And I know William has said or written that perhaps they're both sides of his personality, and perhaps of a lot of people's personalities. And I think that they have been very creative, those two personalities. I'm not sure how William sees them now.
I was actually quite interested to see, Sir Sidney, if there's any way you can reflect on those two figures biographically, and
Well, I don't know. Unfortunately for all of us, there were never any capitalists in my family.
I think that what you're saying is certainly there in the earlier films. But to take the film Tide Table, I'm not sure if that's one of the ones.
Yeah, Tide Table is
Tide
there.
being shown. In this film, you see Soho Eckstein, the man in the suit, on the beach. And he throws a stone into the sea, and a little boy throws a stone into the sea. But this has been pointed out to me, not something I was aware of when drawing it, that there's a very complex set of generational relations and images in the film. The key image of Soho, the man in the pinstripe suit sitting on a deck chair, is in fact based on a photograph of my grandfather, my dad's dad, on Muizenberg Beach in 1933, I think. And next to him sits an 8 or 9-year-old, or 10-year-old boy, if it was 33, 11-year-old, who is my dad, a young boy in a school cap. And when I knew I wanted to do a film about Soho on the beach, and since he always wears a pinstripe suit, he had to be on his pinstripe suit. And only when I'd drawn it did I think, of course, this reminds me of the photograph of my grandfather and dad on the beach. But then to actually make the film, I needed a kind of a model. So I set up a deck chair, and I sat in the deck chair and took different photographs of myself. And then I wanted this image of the boy playing on the beach, and he skims a stone into it. And for this, I asked my son, who was then, I think, 10, to do this for me and use that as a reference. So you have Soho on a beach that on the one hand is my grandfather, on the other hand is myself, and the boy on the beach, which is not really a boy, it's Soho as a young, it's about relationship to one's younger self. So it was thinking of myself on the beach, but that was my son as well as my father, that boy throwing the stone on the beach. So it became this strange set of connections, and what had started off as a very tangential, fragmentary element of the film became for me the heart, and most of the drawing became about those different connections. And the woman from the church group who's in the water and then sitting next to him was very much an image of my nanny, who would have been on the beach with me when I was very young. The cook who had been in the kitchen when Albert Lutuli came in when I was 6. So it became much more it wasn't a meditation on these relations. It wasn't something I was consciously thinking of, but certainly I'm sure that's the undercurrent behind the continuation of those images as one part of the film.
Do you see, given these 10 films, do you see the cycle complete? Or is there still a place for...
I mean, there's always, the films don't have they started in 1989 and I had no idea that they would continue more than the first film, and all these years later, they still, every few years one's done. They start from a need and a desire to work in that technique again, to kind of come back to basics of charcoal, eraser, film camera, and then the material will evolve. So it's not as if that desire to work in that form, in that medium disappears, then I guess the cycle will be complete. If not, I'm sure there will be things that will fit inside or around. Or I was also interested in the most recent one, Other Faces, being very much about Johannesburg now, what the streets of Johannesburg are feeling like. They're changing a lot from my childhood, and I suspect that may well continue. So it's not as if I've decided, or I've ever decided, there need to be 10 films or 8, or this is a complete cycle.
William, you've also not only just made films, a lot of the films themselves came out of theater or were related to theater. So which one, how do you see them? Do you see the films completely as autonomous from the theatrical productions? What are the connections between them?
I think when I came back to working as an artist after the gap, when I'd had several years of not, it was without an idea of having to have a clear structure of what activity could be done and what could not be done. So sometimes, for example, the Ubu project, which became a piece of theatre, started as a set of etchings. The etchings called forth, suggested some kind of performance and animation. That became a complex theatre production with puppets, and out of that came a video. Now, in one sense, you can say this whole complicated making of the theatre with actors, with theatres, with audiences, was a way of arriving at that piece of video, which is kind of the distillation of the project. And obviously, it's the one that endures. The performance, when it's not happening, doesn't exist anymore, but that still can get seen on different. And so I've given up trying to say which in the hierarchy is the final piece. There was the whole opera of the nose, but out of that came the reflection of I am not me, the horse is not mine, which was much broader than the story of the nose and about the show trials and what happens to language under Stalinism. So in a way, I sometimes think that's what will stay. And so a theatre project, when I undertake it, usually has to do knowing that there's more than the theatre that interests me, that will continue and expand around the project of the theatre.
Okay. So Sidney, walking through the exhibition, for you, and thank you so much for your very kind and generous remarks about the exhibition. But having walked through the exhibition, and what sort of memories do those pictures stir in you? Where would you place yourself within the kind of the chronology that the exhibition maps?
Well, I've just been once round the exhibition. It's impossible to see it all just on one visit. I looked very carefully. I didn't see any photographs of myself. Well, there were two things that I got out of it. Some were direct reminders of scenes, for example, outside a court, the court that I was in at the time. Some of my former clients, all looking extraordinarily young. And the other thing which I found quite remarkable, and that's what makes it such a complete exhibition, in this terrible time, and it was a terrible time in South Africa, the period of apartheid was about 44 years. In spite of that, people weren't always doing their political thing or their legal thing or even their artistic thing. Even in a country like that, people had to live their ordinary lives most of the time. And that's what you also see there. You see black people who are subject to these terrible laws which affect them and their children, in unbearable situations. But you see them enjoying themselves. You see them in scenes of friendship and play. And similarly with the whites, I mean, they didn't spend all their time actively oppressing the blacks. I mean, they lived ordinary lives. And that, in a way, is one of the most extraordinary contrasts, that people, and really perhaps people on both sides, all sides of the color spectrum, had to live ordinary lives and do ordinary things like earning a living, practicing a profession, being housewives, and so on. And to me, that is one of the great wonders of this collection here. I can't speak about art with any sort of particular knowledge, but I do believe that to collect this group of photographs, this evidence, to choose them and put them together, takes, if I may say so, a most remarkable skill.
Thank you. William, there's a picture, it's not in the exhibition, but it's in the book, of you as the head of the student union at Wits University, leading a protest with your white bell bottom and a beard just like this, but it's not as
Yes.
as gray.
Right.
And so obviously at this particular time you were also making theater, you were a student activist and so on. Can you talk a little bit about what happened when you had this hiatus in your career before you came back to start making work actively in the 80s? Because at the middle of the show, you see many of your peers and people who came out of school and who later on merged both their own sense of struggle for justice with their own work as individuals.
Well, in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, I remember, which was the most oppressive period of apartheid. I remember seeing the paper and reading the paper about student protests, May '68 in Paris, about student protests in the United States, and I remember thinking, damn, I was 13 at the time. I'm just like 4 years too young to be part of this extraordinary political movement, also on the wrong continent for that period. But the one kind of tiny place where one did see protests was by students from Wits, from one particular university in Johannesburg, on the streets, and there would be a series of baton charges by police, and then students would regroup. White students, of a white university. So there was a small tradition, as it were, of white university students protesting and being involved. In 1976, which was my third year at university, I was 21. I was not the leader of the Students' Council, but I was on the executive of it, one of the student leaders. And in June the 17th, the day after the start of the student uprising, there were meetings, and we decided to do a march through town, not on the basis that this would change anything, but on the basis that if the police had to deploy certain numbers of truckloads of police to come and stop us and contain the student march, that would be that many truckloads of police fewer in Soweto at the minimum. So it was one of a few marches that happened, and I think at a certain point we were chased by the police, as was kind of expected, and some people were arrested. Then I wasn't arrested, I got away. But in the scale of long-term activism, it was very much something. In the later years, I was for a while, during the late 1980s or beginning of the 1990s, part of an artists' collective that I had the rather shameful task at the time of trying to work out the policy for the cultural desk of the African National Congress. At the period when there was a selective cultural boycott of South Africa. They were starting to lift the cultural boycott, but the African National Congress and various anti-apartheid organizations in Europe said, well, we want to know who should we welcome to our museums or theaters and who should we not, which became an impossible task to get artists or theater people to come and have to proclaim their purity. And I discovered then that, in fact, every decision I'd argued for within this organization, the decision had been made the other way. And I realized that what it was is that there were certain members of the committee who loved meetings, and there could never be enough meetings. And the decision would always go in the direction of whoever had the most stamina to go to the next meeting and, in the light of new information, re-look at the decision which had been made. And I realized that my place was in the studio and not at these meetings, and that the most I could kind of do was do my work and, as it were, through a belief in the activity in the studio and what could come out of that, have that as my primary activity. And there were others who were much better at being at meetings, and they stayed in direct politics, and I didn't. But it's what was always present in the studio was the way in which the political questions and social questions could come into the studio and be part of the raw material to be unmade and then remade in the work. And I think that's still very much the way I would work now.
And I wonder if your father has ever, or perhaps Sir Sidney, if you've ever had any cause to defend William or to rescue him. I don't know.
Well, maybe I had a cause to rescue him, but I don't remember ever doing it. Now, can I just say something about what William said about this particular march?
Yeah.
William was in it, no doubt about that. The police officer in charge of the police who were trying to disrupt this march was a police brigadier, a particularly horrible man, whom I'd been in conflict with in court proceedings on a number of occasions. And it was he, this brigadier, who arrested William, and he was charged with being a leader of an unlawful procession through the town. But in fact, this police brigadier gave false evidence about what William was doing there. And I always thought that part of this actual arrest of William and this false evidence against him was partly a way of getting back at me, perhaps. But there was one very fortunate thing that happened. There was a newspaper photographer who was taking photographs of the procession, of the police, and of the arrests made by the police. And these photographs, fortunately, proved conclusively that this police officer's evidence was absolutely false. And when these photographs were produced, Well, then the magistrate had no alternative but reluctantly to acquit William and the others.
I mean, just to clarify things, this was at a later march, not the one in June the 17th. It was a few weeks later when I was arrested with other marchers. And the first day I was not. Later on I was. But I remember Roy Swanepoel, who was in the security police. And I'd remembered him from, was he in the Beaker inquest? Did he?
No.
You hadn't, when had you, I know that you'd...
I had him in other cases, yes.
But there was I remember there was to go back again, down a generation. When my oldest daughter, who's now nearly 30, when she was about 5, I remember she was with us at a conversation at the house where somebody was reporting how a policeman had said that the most intimidating thing that had ever happened to him in his life was being cross-examined by my father. At which my daughter Alice said, "Sydney, intimidating? He's the least intimidating man I know," as a granddaughter speaking of a grandfather. So I just need to record for both of us, well, for me, how moving it is and how astonishing it is to be here in what feels like my terrain, an art museum, to be doing this talk with you. And I was so delighted when you agreed to do it with me, and thank you for that, Dad.